Meanwhile, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is set to present a new budget on May 21st. South Africans are waiting to hear how Treasury will balance the books and where government is likely to cut to make up for the touted 75 billion rand budget shortfall created by the withdrawal of a VAT hike. The Alternative Information and Development Centre has called for the implementation of alternative revenue-raising options, saying the rejection of the VAT hike should not deepen budget cuts. The Centre's Economic Justice Project Officer Aliya Chikte joins us now with more detail. Thank you so much for your time, Aliya. Let's actually start off at the top because, I mean, when the Finance Minister had proposed this VAT hike, he had basically put in place relief measures to basically cushion poor households from the adverse effects of a VAT hike. Do those go out the window now, and were they sufficient in the first place?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So some of those measures include expanding the list of items which are exempt from VAT. And I think this one in particular will be withdrawn. Other examples include real increases to social grants, and it is unclear at this stage exactly like how much these will increase, but there is a great risk that this will also not be increased in the new budget or not increased to this extent.
Yeah.
But I think it is also important to remember that these measures were not enough and insufficient to cushion the burden on low-income households.
Yeah.
So for the exemption of zero-rated items, it's
Yeah.
only being expanded to offal and tinned vegetables. And when you look at the affordability of the household food basket, it's out of reach for the 55% of the population who live in poverty.
Yeah, and it's actually quite sad to see that even those measures would really not do anything to cushion that what is called a regressive tax. Now, the DA did highlight that they do need to be expenditure cuts. They're actually against any tax hikes of any sorts, and they've said that they want expenditure cuts. But the ICD is saying that that should not be an option. Why?
Yeah, so even the finance minister himself said that austerity is self-defeating. And this is the first time that he has done this after years and years of austerity and budget cuts. So what this means is that when we have had austerity cuts, austerity measures and spending cuts, this has not resulted in a reduction of the debt to GDP ratio. And actually, the debt has been growing. And so when the government spends less, the economy grows more, there are not as many jobs created. So people have less spending power, not as much money in their pockets. And so and this means that the economy grows slower than debt. So this is why we think that there should be a rejection of austerity measures and spending cuts, and we should rather opt for more progressive revenue-raising options. And there are a number of these, both in the immediate term and in the medium term as well.
And is this also because there's a concern that these expenditure cuts may be so aggressive that they would actually compromise service delivery?
Exactly. So that's also a big part of like that's probably like the main reason, like the impact that this that spending cuts will have on communities, on service delivery. If we look at the number of scholars in a classroom, if we look at how hospitals are overcrowded, there have been many years of austerity measures, and this has had a devastating impact on healthcare, on education, and on social protection. The measures have not been enough to the increases in both budget 1.0 and budget 2.0 has not been enough to address years of underfunding in critical sectors. And what we also need to be aware of is like the gendered impact of what austerity means when spending is cut. Who is it that takes up the role of providing these services in communities and in households.
Yeah, it's actually quite crazy. You mentioned budget 1.0 and budget 2.0, and now we're talking about budget 3.0. I mean, Aliya, the fact that Treasury opted for an increase in VAT as a source of revenue was because they couldn't find any other alternatives for a tax increase. So is a tax source even an option at this point, especially with the DA stance?
So there are different types of tax options, right?
Yeah.
And what we as the Alternative Information Development Center have been saying is that there needs to be progressive tax options. We're saying that VAT is a regressive tax because it disproportionately affects the working class. But there are several other alternatives, like a wealth tax, that could be looked at, which in the context of South Africa's world-beating inequality is not only fiscally necessary, but it's a moral imperative as well. And then I think beyond taxes, there are also other things which can be looked at, like such as a pause in the government's contributions to the government's employees' pension fund, which has a surplus of 60 billion rand in 2024. And will still continue to have a surplus and continue to grow even with a pause in government contributions. And I think it's important to highlight when talking about the GPF that even if there is a pause, workers' pensions will not be at risk, and this could bring in 53 billion rand of revenue. I also just want to say that the shortfall, I think in the beginning of the segment, we spoke about a 75 billion rand shortfall, but this is exaggerated by Treasury.
Okay.
So in this financial year, if you take away the VAT hike, we are left with 11.5 billion rand. Then you will also note that SARS has been able to find an additional 8.8 billion rands worth of revenue. So this actually leaves a shortfall of 2.7 billion rand for this financial year, which is a lot smaller than Treasury is making it seem to be.
Yeah. Are all these long-term measures, or are some of them, because I mean, the fact that we went for a VAT increase means that we needed something immediate. There's a sense of urgency. Are any of these things that can be implemented where we could actually see gains in the short term?
Yeah, so I think something like cancelling the medical aid tax credits for high income earners is something that's immediate. A pause on the government employees pension fund is immediate. Other things like a wealth tax or capacitating SARS to cover the 800 billion rand tax gap are more in the medium term. But there are short-term immediate options available.
All right. Well, in terms of the long-term measures, of course, we know that economic growth and sustainable economic growth is exactly what is needed. We know what is needed from that, structural reforms and the like. But there was quite an interesting note that I saw, line that I saw in your note, that we urgently need long-term growth. This will require a fundamental shift away from the neoliberal obsession with shrinking the role of the state. Does this mean that in our quest for economic growth, we still need to keep in mind that the state does play an important role and shrinking it is not the way to go?
Yeah, definitely. So when you think about the role of the state, it's not just serving the poor, it's serving everybody. And I think like the role that the state plays in education, in healthcare, in social development, in public infrastructure, in industrial policy, which is something which we don't talk about enough, is crucial. And I think that when we talk about the removal of the VAT and like what alternatives there are to replace the VAT, we're talking about just keeping things as they are and steady. But what we need is a real stimulus in the economy in terms of industrial policy, in terms of the productive sector to create jobs and to get us out of this massive unemployment.
Yeah, and I guess that's also the concern in terms of expenditure cuts, that it may not just be for, your services like health care, education, but that it actually might spill over to infrastructure expenditure that we actually need to stimulate the economy. Well, we will see on the 21st of May what that all looks like. Thank you so much for your time and just giving us insight on those alternatives that could be looked at in terms of raising revenue. That was Aliya Chikte, Economic Justice Project Officer at the Alternative Information Development Center.